Solis IV, The Crimson Descent by David Hall 0705-2025. Chapter Breakdown. Chapter 1, The Sky Bleeds. Chapter 2, The Taste of Madness. Chapter 3, The Long Night. Chapter 4, The End of Reason. Chapter 5, The Final Harvest. Chapter 6, The Imperial Judgment. Summary. Solis IV, The Crimson Descent tells the grim tale of a peaceful farming colony on the edge of the Maelstrom, where a strange, blood-red sky heralds a descent into madness. Over several months, the once thriving community becomes consumed by violent insanity, with its inhabitants tearing each other apart in bloody, unrelenting chaos. The colonists' final moments are marked by horrific bloodshed, and the colony is ultimately left in ruins, its survivors wiped out. An investigation by the Imperial Guard follows, with a team dispatched to uncover the truth behind the colony's disappearance. What they find is a world scarred beyond repair, where the remnants of humanity lie in twisted piles, victims of an unseen, malevolent force. Despite their grim discovery, the Imperium offers no salvation, choosing to seal the planet off and abandon it, deeming it lost forever to the Maelstrom's influence. The last chapter of Solis IV is written in blood, a tragic footnote in the galaxy's endless wars, as the Imperium moves on without a second thought for those who perished in madness. Chapter 1, The Sky Bleeds. For months, the crimson sky hung over Solis IV, a deep, unsettling red that never wavered. The farmers of the colony, once proud of their hard work and quiet lives, began to speak of it in whispers. No one truly understood the phenomenon, though many tried. Some called it a sign of the Emperor's displeasure, others blamed the warp, but most just avoided the subject altogether. There was a sense of unease, but life continued. Solis IV had been a quiet place, nestled in the green rolling hills of its fertile plains. The land was rich, the crops bountiful, and the people were simple, too simple, perhaps, to understand what was creeping toward them. But the sky was wrong. The first few days, it had been almost beautiful, an odd, surreal spectacle, like a sunset frozen in time, the redness shimmering like blood soaked into fabric. Children ran through the fields, their laughter untainted, their eyes staring up at the unnatural hue. But then, as the days stretched into weeks, the color deepened, darkening the horizon with its oppressive glow. Farmers who once worked alongside one another began to argue over trivial matters, petty squabbles, clashes over land boundaries, water rations, all things that had been forgotten before. Tensions rose, but they were still a distant memory of something once held in check. Now, the arguments were louder, fiercer, more violent. In the barns, hushed conversations stirred, muttered between clenched teeth. Men who had once shared a drink after a long day in the fields now looked at each other with suspicion, eyes darting. Women who had once helped each other with chores started to whisper behind closed doors, casting glances over their shoulders. The first death came quietly. A farmer, his face twisted in some unrecognizable expression, had been found dead in his field. No obvious wound, no sign of foul play. He had simply stopped moving. His body was still warm when they found him, but his eyes were wide and glassy, a grotesque blankness etched into his face. It was unsettling, but not enough to spark real fear. Not yet. More deaths followed in the coming weeks. It became routine, almost expected. Sometimes, the bodies were found in the fields, at other times inside homes, as if the victims had simply died in their sleep. But the whispers grew louder. Something wasn't right. Something was changing. And then came the madness. It started slowly, like a creeping fever. A woman screamed in the night, her voice ragged and hoarse. No one could understand her words, only the terror in her cries. The next day, a neighbor found her in the kitchen, the floor slick with blood. She had gouged out her own eyes, her hands covered in deep, bloody gashes. The walls around her were painted with her frantic attempts to escape, dragging her mutilated form across the floor in a desperate, senseless struggle. No one had heard a thing. After that, the madness spread like wildfire. In the markets, once bustling with life and friendly chatter, people began to fight, not for food or resources, but for the sheer thrill of it. People tore into each other with their bare hands, tearing flesh, crushing bones. Men and women, once family, now mere animals. Blood stained the streets as their screams echoed under the red sky, reverberating against the stone walls of the settlement. The children, innocent and unknowing, had become the first victims of the madness. They were the first to fall to the frenzy, torn apart by their own parents, their eyes wide with confusion and pain. The sounds of broken bodies and twisted limbs mixed with the guttural growls of those who had lost all sense of self. The sky above grew darker. It had become more than just an ominous presence. It felt like a weight, pressing down on the land and suffocating the souls of the living. With each passing day, the people became more frenzied, more desperate. Even those who fought to hold on to their sanity were slowly consumed. No one was spared from the influence of the sky. The madness reached into every home, every heart, every mind. The colony was no longer a place of life. It was a tomb, a slaughterhouse. The last remnants of order, of peace, were crumbling away under the weight of the crimson sky. There would be no survivors. Not here, not now. Chapter 2, The Taste of Madness. By the third month, the air itself seemed to pulse with the madness that had taken root in the colony. The crimson sky had grown darker, thickening like blood congealing in a wound, and the people of Solis IV were no longer themselves. They had become creatures of hunger, hunger for violence, for blood, for the sweet release of slaughter. The first group to fully succumb to the madness was the council, once the pillars of the community, the men and women who governed with a sense of duty and honor. It had started with their meetings. Arguments grew heated over trivial matters, each member of the council quick to lash out at the others. The air in their chambers was thick with tension, their once familiar voices now raw with anger. It wasn't long before the first fight broke out. The eldest of the council members, a man named Lucas Haran, had been struck by his own son, a broad-shouldered farmer with a reputation for kindness. The strike wasn't hard, but it was enough to break something. Lucas screamed, his face twisted in fury, and then something snapped. He lunged at his son, teeth bared, hands trembling with rage. His son screamed in shock, but it didn't stop Lucas. He ripped into his flesh with savage abandon, gnawing at the exposed skin of his son's neck like an animal. The others stood frozen, eyes wide, as father and son became locked in a violent dance of death. The chamber became a bloodbath. No one knew who struck the first blow, but soon enough, the council members were tearing into each other with a frenzied, feral madness. The once proud leaders of the colony were reduced to little more than beasts, their once sophisticated minds lost to the bloodlust that spread like a contagion. The walls of the council hall were painted red, a gruesome display of torn flesh, shredded clothing, and guttural screams. It was a massacre, and it was only the beginning. Outside the council hall, the rest of the colony was not faring any better. In the streets, blood ran freely, pooling around the dead bodies of those who had succumbed to the same madness. The once bustling market square was now a scene of carnage, littered with the remnants of torn corpses, shattered limbs, and broken faces. The smell of death was thick in the air, mixing with the stench of sweat and fear. People, what was left of them, roamed the streets like predators, their eyes wild, their hands stained with blood. No one was spared, even the children, those who had once been kept safe in the houses, protected from the horrors outside, were not immune. In a small home at the edge of the settlement, a mother stood over her own child, knife in hand. The boy, no more than 7, whimpered, his wide, terrified eyes reflecting the crimson sky outside. He cried out for his mother to stop, but she was beyond hearing him. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the desire to see him bleed. The knife plunged into his throat with a sickening wet sound, and she watched, almost entranced, as the life drained from his body. It was the taste of madness, and it was sweet, but not all were consumed so easily. There were those who fought, who tried to hold on to some semblance of their old selves. A small group of farmers, led by a man named Arlen Drag, had barricaded themselves inside one of the larger barns. They huddled together in fear, clutching weapons and praying to the Emperor that they might survive. But even they could feel it, the creeping, insidious urge to give in, to turn on one another. The madness gnawed at the edges of their minds, pulling at their sanity, whispering in their ears. One night, As the group slept, it happened. A scream cut through the silence. Alan awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, trying to make sense of the noise, but all he could see were shadows dancing in the dim light of their fire. Another scream, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of flesh tearing. Alan stood, his instincts screaming at him to act, to protect the others, but as he moved, he saw it. The madness had found them. One of the women, a quiet soul who had never shown an ounce of aggression, stood in the middle of the barn, holding a blood-soaked hammer in her hands. The bodies of two of the men lay at her feet, their skulls shattered, their brains spilled out onto the dirt floor. She was smiling, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if in a trance. "You see?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with something dark. "It's all we have left now." Before anyone could react, she turned, her hammer rising high. Alan barely had time to dodge as the weapon came crashing down, striking the wooden support beam instead of his skull. But the madness had spread. He could see it in the eyes of the others. His friends, his neighbors, the people he had known his entire life, were all consumed by it. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own screams as they tore him apart. Chapter 3, The Long Night. The crimson sky never faded. By now, the people of Solis IV had been reduced to little more than feral creatures, driven by an insatiable thirst for blood. The once quiet farms and fields had become killing grounds, a place where the only rule was survival at any cost. The settlement was a place of slaughter, and those who still drew breath were no longer recognizable as the people they had once been. The madness had taken root in their minds, twisting them beyond repair. The world outside the colony had become a blur. Nothing mattered but the next kill. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, not for food, but for violence. Hunger for the thrill of it, hunger for the sight of blood, and the longer they waited, the more the madness grew. It became an addiction, an itch that had to be scratched. The sky, forever crimson, pressed down on them like an invisible weight, smothering them, suffocating them. It was in the early hours of the morning that they came across the stranger. The man appeared from the mist that had rolled in from the northern plains, walking slowly, as though unsure of his own footing. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his clothes were torn and stained with the telltale signs of a long journey. He had not yet succumbed to the madness, but it was clear that he had seen things, horrible things. The blood on his hands spoke of violence, though he seemed almost distant, as though numb to it all. A group of survivors, their eyes wild and their hands clutching crude weapons, had gathered around the gates of the colony. They had been waiting for anyone who might bring them hope, someone who might still be sane enough to lead them out of the hell they were trapped in. But when they saw him, standing in the distance, his face twisted with exhaustion, a murmur of excitement trickled through the group. He was no salvation, he was another victim, another soul to be consumed by the madness. At first, the man seemed to hesitate. He looked at the group of survivors, his gaze lingering on the blood-soaked faces of the people who stood before him. His lips trembled, but he said nothing. He simply stared, as if unsure of his own place in this dying world. Then, without warning, a woman stepped forward. Her name was Elisa, and she was one of the last to hold on to some fragment of what had once been human in her. Her eyes, though clouded with terror, still held the spark of a person who had not yet fully succumbed. She had watched the others, friends, family, become monsters. She had fought them, tried to keep them from the depths of madness, but it was no use. She knew what had to happen now. They were beyond saving. "Help us," Elisa whispered, her voice cracked, her lips pale and bloodless. She took a cautious step closer to the stranger. "We're running out of time." The man didn't answer. His hands, shaking, reached toward his belt, and Elisa could see the faint outline of a blade, half drawn but not yet unsheathed. The madness was in him, too. She could see it in his eyes now, a flicker of the same hunger that had infected everyone else. Without warning, Elisa lunged at him. The others followed suit, driven by an instinct they couldn't control, their minds now too far gone to recognize what they were doing. The stranger's blade was pulled free, but it was too late. Elisa's fingers sank into his throat before he could swing it. Blood sprayed across the ground, a crimson fountain that stained her hands and arms. She felt it, the rush of power, the primal satisfaction as his life drained away. For a moment, there was silence. The group of survivors, now no more than killers, stood over the body of the man, their breathing ragged, their faces flushed with the heat of their victory. There was no remorse, no hesitation. They had taken another life, and in doing so, they had fed the madness that had consumed them all. But even as they stood over the corpse, the feeling didn't subside. There was no relief, no sense of closure. The hunger remained. It always remained. The crimson sky loomed overhead, watching them, waiting for more. Chapter 4, The End of Reason. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless, blood-drenched hours. The red sky remained, a sickly, oppressive glow that never wavered. The madness was no longer an event, it had become the reality of life. In Solis IV, no one spoke of the past, no one remembered who they had once been. The crimson sky had erased all remnants of their former lives, leaving behind only the instincts of survival and the hunger for violence. The colony's remaining survivors had scattered, now no longer forming any semblance of a community. Some hid in the remnants of their homes, trembling, unable to resist the calls of the madness that still gnawed at their souls. Others had become predators, stalking the fields for any remaining living thing they could tear apart. They had become something else entirely, beasts who knew only the hunt and the kill. But Alyssa, now covered in the blood of the stranger and of countless others, has begun to change. It wasn't the bloodlust that consumed her. It was something deeper, something more insidious. She felt it, the urge to tear into something, to claw at flesh and break bone. But it wasn't the same as the others. She wasn't driven by mere hunger. She had begun to hear the whispers, the voices that slipped into her mind during the quiet moments, when she tried to sleep. The madness had taken root in her, but it was now working its way under her skin, burrowing deeper, infecting the very core of her being. The madness didn't just make people kill, it broke their minds, twisted their souls until there was nothing left but hunger and rage. Alyssa had once been kind. Once, she had been a woman who cared for the injured, who helped the sick, who shared a kind word with the children. Now, she was nothing more than a thing that wandered the ruins of a dead colony. The cries of the others, the ones who still begged for salvation, were a dull hum in her mind. She no longer heard their desperation as a plea for help. It was noise, it was nothing. She had watched them all die, and now, the only thing that remained was the inevitable collapse of the last of them. But the final moments would not come gently. As the last of the survivors, those few who had held out hope for a way out of the madness, had gathered in a small church at the center of the colony, a stillness fell over them. The flickering flames of their last fire cast long shadows against the walls. They had built barricades, huddled together, hoping that the shelter might somehow protect them. They had no illusions left. The madness was inevitable, and they all knew it. The crimson sky hung outside, a permanent reminder of their fate. The people inside the church had long since abandoned any notion of escape. They were waiting for the end, praying to a god they no longer believed in, praying for death to come quickly and end their suffering. Then Alyssa entered. Her bloodied form appeared in the doorway like a specter, her eyes wide, gleaming with an eerie, unnatural glow. She looked at them, her head tilted to one side, her lips stretched into a faint smile that twisted her face into something grotesque. The madness was in her now. She could feel it flowing through her veins like poison. "Do you still hope?" she asked, her voice thin, hollow. The survivors looked at her, some with fear, others with resignation. They knew what she had become. They knew what was happening. One by one, they stood, weapons trembling in their hands, but they did not fight. It was too late for that. The madness had taken them all, and there was no escaping it now. Alyssa stepped forward, her hands held out in front of her as though welcoming them to the inevitable. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The survivors hesitated for only a moment before the bloodlust overtook them. They rushed at her, not as people anymore, but as mindless beasts, driven by the hunger to destroy. Their eyes glazed with the same fever that had consumed them all. Alyssa stood motionless, waiting. It didn't take long for the chaos to erupt. Flesh was torn, bone shattered, and screams filled the air. Alyssa was no longer afraid. She was no longer anything but an extension of the madness, She felt the rush of power as they tore into each other, as they fought and killed in their blind rage. There were no thoughts now, only violence. The blood flowed like a river, coating the walls, the floor, the ceiling, coating everything. It was the culmination of everything that had happened, the last of Solis IV's people, brought together in one final, bloody massacre. No one would survive, no one could. Alyssa's final thought, as the madness tore through her, was that the red sky had won, the colony was lost. Solis IV had been consumed by its own darkness, swallowed whole by the very thing that had once held them all together. The Emperor had not answered their prayers, and no salvation had come. There had been no redemption, there would be no survivors. Chapter 5, The Final Harvest. The church, once a place of hope and solace, had become a slaughterhouse. The blood-soaked floors reflected the flickering flames from the dying fire, casting long, distorted shadows across the crumpled bodies of the last few survivors. Alyssa stood at the center of it all, her clothes soaked in the gore of those who had once been her neighbors, her friends, her fellow survivors. Her hands, trembling slightly, were still stained with the blood of the final struggle. The chaos had subsided quickly, as it always did. There had been no heroes in this story, no one to stand up against the tide of madness that had drowned Solis IV. The survivors, those few who had once dared to resist, had given in without much of a fight. Their final cries had been swallowed by the darkness, as had the last traces of their humanity. Alyssa looked down at the mangled bodies around her. The stench of death was thick in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke from the burning fire and the decay of broken flesh. Her heart, if it still beat, might have been racing, but there was nothing left to feel. She was numb. The madness had consumed her, had overtaken everything. There was nothing left but the aftermath of carnage, the ruins of a community torn apart by an evil greater than any had imagined. Her eyes drifted toward the altar, where a shattered crucifix lay, broken in two. Once, it had been a symbol of faith and hope, a reminder that there was always light even in the darkest of times. But that was before the sky had turned crimson, before the madness had crept into their minds, stripping them of everything they once held dear. Now, the altar was nothing more than a cold, empty stone, stained with the blood of those who had once worshipped before it. Alyssa turned away, her eyes searching the room. The crimson sky outside bathed everything in an eerie glow, its presence like a silent judge, watching, waiting for the final verdict. She could see the bloodied remains of the others in the corners of the room, their twisted expressions frozen in a final moment of terror, shock, or pain. They had been people, once. They had been farmers, children, priests, soldiers, all of them, wiped from existence in the span of a few months, undone by the madness that had taken root. And yet, in some strange, sick way, Alyssa felt a strange peace settle over her. This was the end. This was the final chapter in a story that had been written long before she had ever stepped foot on Solis IV. The world had been doomed from the start, but now, with the colony's descent into madness, it was finally over. She walked to the door, stepping carefully over the bodies that littered the floor. Her feet, caked in the thick, sticky mess of blood, left prints as she moved. The sun, if it could still be called that, hung low in the sky, casting a deep red glow across the ruined landscape outside. The fields, once full of life and work, were now barren and empty. The trees that lined the edges of the settlement were twisted and warped, as though the very earth itself had been affected by the madness that had spread through the colony. There was no sign of life beyond the church, no animals scurrying through the grass, no birds in the sky. It was as if the world had been drained of all color, all vibrancy, all hope. In the distance, the ruins of the farmhouses lay in shambles, their once proud walls reduced to rubble. Alyssa stood at the threshold of the church, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She looked out at the horizon, where the red sky stretched endlessly, an unbroken sea of blood. She felt the pull, the beckoning of something dark and ancient within her, urging her to cross the threshold and join the others in the final death of the colony. But she hesitated. For a brief moment, she remembered who she had been before the madness. She remembered the small things, the way the wind had felt on her face as a child, the warmth of the sun on her skin during harvest season, the laughter of friends and family around the dinner table. She had once been someone who had cared, who had loved, who had believed in the future, but all that was gone now. It had been lost to the madness, consumed by the red sky. With a final, shallow breath, Elisa stepped outside. The wind howled as it swept across the barren plains, the sound a mournful cry that seemed to echo across the desolate landscape. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as though each movement drained her of the last remnants of strength. She walked into the fields, past the remains of the farms, past the shattered houses and broken fences. There was nowhere left to go, there was nothing left to see. She wandered for hours, though time had become meaningless, as the sky grew darker, more oppressive, until it seemed to close in on her. The red light from above bled into the land, casting everything in a sickly, unnatural glow. Elisa didn't know where she was going anymore. There was no destination, there was no salvation, only the endless wasteland before her, stretching out into oblivion. And then, as she walked, she heard the sound. At first, it was just a whisper, carried by the wind, but as she pressed on, it grew louder, a soft, persistent sound, like a distant murmur, growing steadily closer. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes scanning the empty horizon. The sound grew louder still, until it was unmistakable, a voice, calling her name. The voice was familiar, and yet she could not place it. It was soft, soothing, and yet there was something wrong with it, something that set her nerves on edge. Elisa's hands shook as she turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. "Elisa," the voice called again, a faint laugh trailing the words, "come closer." She stepped forward, unsure of why she was doing it, but unable to stop herself. The madness was still there, its dark grip never fully leaving her. And then, as she reached the crest of a hill, she saw it, the Maelstrom. It loomed in the distance, an inky black void swirling with dark energies. The wind picked up, howling fiercely as the edges of the storm flickered with unnatural lightning. There was no escape. There never had been. As the madness took her completely, Elisa fell to her knees, and the last whisper of reason left her forever. The storm claimed her, and Solis IV was lost. Chapter 6. The Imperial Judgment. Weeks passed since the last of the survivors were consumed by the madness. The faintest traces of Solis IV's once thriving colony had been obliterated, erased from memory by the violence of its own people. The Maelstrom, that shifting, chaotic storm of warp energy that had loomed just beyond the horizon, seemed to pulse with malevolent glee at the death of the colony. The red sky above had faded to black, but the horror it left in its wake would never be forgotten. The Imperium, however, did not forget. A shuttle dropped from the dark expanse of space, the hull groaning against the heavy atmosphere of the planet. It was a ship of the Imperial Guard, sent to investigate the disappearance of the colony and report back on the status of Solis IV. The men aboard had been given little information, only that something terrible had happened to the colony, and it was their duty to investigate. The shuttle touched down in a clearing, its heavy engines kicking up dirt and ash as it settled onto the planet's surface. The squad of soldiers disembarked in standard formation, their black and grey armor dull under the dying light of the darkened sky. They moved with practiced precision, weapons at the ready. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the earth beneath them scorched and barren, and a strange, sickly warmth hung in the atmosphere. Sergeant Yoren, a grizzled veteran of too many wars, stood at the front, his face obscured by the helmet of his rebreather mask. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, narrowing as they fell on the empty expanse. There were no signs of life, no movement. The silence was deafening. "Report back, Sergeant," came the cold voice of Colonel Velt, a man with little patience for anything that didn't involve the sharp point of the Emperor's justice. "Find out what happened here, investigate, but do not engage unless absolutely necessary." Yoren nodded curtly, his gaze never leaving the desolate landscape. He had seen death and ruin in many forms, but something about this felt different, unnatural, as though the land itself had been scarred by something older and darker than the Imperium could fully comprehend. The squad moved forward, walking cautiously toward the smoldering remains of the colony. The first structure they came across was a collapsed farmhouse, the walls crumbled and burnt, the doors hanging off their hinges. They searched it quickly, but found nothing of interest, only bloodstains and the faintest traces of what could have been a struggle. But there were no bodies, not here, not anywhere. They continued their search, walking deeper into the ruined settlement. The city square was completely abandoned, the fountains dry, the streets choked with dust. The once proud cathedral, now nothing more than a broken shell of its former self, loomed in the center of the square. Its steeple was twisted, the stone cracked, as if something had torn through it from within. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been shredded in this place. Yoren's squad entered the cathedral cautiously. Inside, the stench of death was thick, and the walls were slick with the dried remnants of blood. In the center of the sanctuary, a pile of bodies lay in a twisted heap, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Some of the bodies were mutilated, their flesh torn asunder by something far too brutal for a mere human hand. There was no question now, whatever had happened here, whatever had caused this madness, it had been terrible beyond measure. Sergeant Yoren approached the altar slowly, his boots scrunching over the debris. He stood before the shattered crucifix, his hand hovering over the blood-stained stone. He could feel it, the dark presence that lingered here, a presence so palpable that it seemed to resonate with the maelstrom that hovered just beyond the colony's borders. It was as if the land itself had become tainted, infected by something beyond comprehension. He turned back to his squad. "There's nothing here, nothing we can do." The soldiers, who had once been hopeful for answers, now seemed distant, their gazes unfocused as they processed the horror before them. Yoren's eyes narrowed, his breath fogging up the inside of his rebreather mask. "We'll report back to command. This place is lost." Imperial Command. The transmission reached Imperial Command days later. Sergeant Yoren's report was as clinical and detached as one might expect from the Imperial Guard. The squad had found nothing that could explain the madness that had ravaged the colony. There were no survivors, no evidence of outside interference, only the blood, only the bodies, only the ruins. The response was swift. As expected, abandon the planet, seal it off. The maelstrom is too close. The colony is lost. Any survivors are beyond saving. Any further attempts at recovery are not to be attempted. The Emperor has spoken. A grim sense of finality settled over Yoren as he read the orders. He felt his hand tremble slightly as he transmitted the final message back to command. The Maelstrom had claimed Solis IV. There would be no further investigation, no retribution, no reckoning. Solis IV was marked as lost to the Imperium, a footnote in the history of the galaxy, a tragic story, soon to be forgotten, and with it, the squad was recalled, their mission complete. The shuttle lifted from the surface of Solis IV, disappearing into the void, leaving behind a planet that was now a grave, its horror fading into the depths of the Imperium's archives. Solis IV was lost to time, to madness, to the Maelstrom, and the Imperium would move on. It always did.